Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. As the Trump administration mobilizes to stop the COVID-19 pandemic at home, its actions overseas are having the opposite impact. U.S. sanctions on countries including Venezuela and Iran are hurting those countries' ability to fight the pandemic. Just this week, the Trump administration ramped up its actions against Iran, announcing a whole new round of sanctions. Well, joining me now is someone who knows the impact of sanctions very well. Alfred de Zayas is a former UN Special Rapporteur who has studied the impact of sanctions on countries overseas, including Venezuela. Professor de Zayas, welcome to Pushback.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, what is your response to seeing, in the midst of this pandemic, the Trump administration announcing new sanctions on Iran?
Well, it's insane, but it's also a crime against humanity. And it might even be a form of genocide, depending on the number of victims that will be generated directly through these sanctions. In my 6 years as UN rapporteur, I wrote about sanctions in several of my reports. So did my colleague, the late Ambassador Idris Yasairi, who passed away on the 27th of February of this year. In any event, he was a rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, and he was very clear in analyzing the sanctions against Venezuela, the sanctions against Iran and Syria, etc. Now, it's quite clear that unilateral coercive measures are contrary to the United Nations Charter. They're contrary to customary international law, to very fundamental principles of international law, such as freedom of trade and freedom of navigation, etc. Now, in a situation like COVID-19, what the world needs, of course, we're all on this planet together, is international solidarity. What we need is cooperation. Now, this is throwing an additional monkey wrench into the capacity of Iran and Syria and Venezuela to cope with this challenge of the coronavirus. Now, I would like to see the United Nations General Assembly adopt a resolution. They've already adopted 27 resolutions with regard to the sanctions against Cuba, condemning them. But this is a moment in which we need a word from the General Assembly, from the international community, from the International Court of Justice, clearly stating that unilateral coercive measures kill. The unilateral coercive measures, this kind of hybrid warfare, this kind of non-conventional warfare is incompatible with the United Nations Charter, and that it has consequences. It has human consequences. People die. It also has a component of penal law. I think that the International Criminal Court has to take it up also. In the case of Venezuela, the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariasa, on the 13th of February of this year, at The Hague, presented a brief, a complaint with regard to the unilateral coercive measures being applied against Venezuela, and asking under Article 7 of the Statute of Rome that they be examined under the aspect of a crime against humanity. But it is not just a crime against humanity. Of course it is. I mean, read Article 7 of the Rome Statute, and you will see that because of the deliberateness of it, because of the impact that it has had already on Venezuela, it has already gone beyond the threshold of just a mere violation of international law. It might even reach the level of genocide. Now, Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948 states that if a country has a policy that has as its goal the uh, decimation of a people, a group, an ethnic group, a religious group, or whatever, that constitutes genocide.
That's a very thorough summation of the how sanctions violate international law. But let me ask you about what you specifically witnessed, because you were the first special rapporteur to visit Venezuela in over 2 decades, and you wrote a very thorough report last year on this. And you write this, quote, "Modern day economic sanctions and blockades are comparable with medieval sieges of towns. 21st century sanctions attempt to bring not just a town, but sovereign countries to their knees." That was from your report on the impact of sanctions on Venezuela. What specifically did you witness in Venezuela to lead you to that conclusion?
Well, I did not witness a humanitarian crisis, as I know from Syria and Gaza and Yemen, etc. What I did notice, and that has been confirmed by my colleagues, Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot, that these sanctions have led directly to an increase in deaths. That is, persons who normally would not have died, but because they didn't have access to insulin or to antiretroviral drugs or access to anti-malaria drugs, died. Now, the government is trying to purchase this all necessary medicines for the population, but as a result of the financial blockade, when the government is trying to transfer money to through a bank to, say, the pharmaceutical company, etc., the bank, out of fear of penalties from the United States Treasury, refuses to make the transfer. That has created enormous problem because Venezuela is a very, very wealthy country. But if it cannot buy and sell like anybody else, it doesn't help them any money. If it cannot extract the petroleum, cannot extract the gold and the bauxite and the lithium and the coltan and everything that they have, it's of course an economy that has been asphyxiated and asphyxiated on purpose. This is very similar to back in 1970 when Salvador Allende was elected in Chile, and Nixon called in Kissinger and told him, we will not tolerate an alternative economic model to be successful in Latin America, and we shall make the Chilean economy scream. Now, that is what has happened in Venezuela. The Venezuelan economy is practically ground to a halt. Now, they are trying to be as self-sufficient as they can. And Latin Americans tend to improvise a lot, the same as the Cubans. I mean, the Cubans have suffered draconian sanctions and draconian blockade for 60 years. 60. And the Cuban people have not rebelled. Now, in connection with Iran, I was thinking of this maximum pressure campaign that Trump has declared a year ago on Iran. Well, a recent analysis by the Israel-based Institute for National Security Studies has concluded that these sanctions have been ineffective. I mean, what the United States would like to see, and it's very, very naive. I mean, when I hear Mike Pompeo, or I hear Elliot Abrams, or I hear, John Bolton, who mercifully has left the White House. But in any event, they think that failure in the economy is going to lead to a revolt on the part of the civilian population. Well, that's not happened in Cuba, has not happened in Venezuela, is not happening in Iran. Why? Because as the Institute for National Security Studies determines, the Iranian public has despaired of generating any significant political change. And obviously, they are focused on the struggle for day-to-day survival. And that is in Iran, that is in Cuba, that is in Venezuela. They have other worries. Now, I made this medieval allusion in my report to the Human Rights Council, but I've also made another allusion that I think is worth thinking about. The siege of Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 44 by the Nazis, 872 days, cost anywhere from 700,000 to 1 million human lives. That was declared a crime against humanity by the Nuremberg judgment, and quite correctly so. It was a crime against humanity. And as far as Iran is concerned, as far as Venezuela is concerned, as far as the coronavirus is concerned, what we need today is human solidarity. I mean, if the enemy was an extraterrestrial, if the enemy was an alien, we would be all joining forces to fight this outside enemy. Now, the enemy now is the coronavirus. You would expect the United States to join forces with Europe, to join forces with India, to join forces with China in fighting this new danger to humanity. And what the United States is doing is insane.
You've been inside the UN system for a long time. Let's say, countries like Iran and Venezuela wanted to try to stop the sanctions and pursue reparations, as you've talked about, pursue court judgments against the US in a bid to get them to stop strangulating their countries. What hope do you have that working inside the UN system, international law, could actually succeed, given the amount of influence that the US and its allies have over the UN and the international system?
Well, there is a culture of impunity in the United States. There is a certain hubris, which actually reminds me of the hubris of Joachim von Ribbentrop during the Nazi period, an arrogance of power. And obviously, the United States cannot be forced to respect a judgment of the International Court of Justice. As a matter of fact, there have been any number of judgments against the United States that were flouted by Washington. Take, for instance, the Nicaragua against United States cases in the 1980s during Ronald Reagan. And the United States was solidly condemned for its illegal support of the Contras in Nicaragua and its attempt to topple the government, the democratically elected government of the Sandinistas.
And for mining the harbors, for literally mining the harbors around Nicaragua.
No, these are all war crimes, and these are all what we term international wrongful acts that trigger state responsibility to make reparation. That was also the judgment of the International Court of Justice, and the United States never paid. Now, we also had a number of cases under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, when the two German brothers, Legrand, had committed a capital offense in Texas, and they did not have appropriate defense. I mean, it was a farce of a trial against them. In any event, the German consul was never informed about it. That's a clear violation of the Vienna Convention. Well, the International Court of Justice issued what you might term an injunction, issued a interim measures of protection telling the United States you cannot execute the Legrand brothers. Well, they were executed. And a couple of years down the line, in the case of Avena and 51 others, these were Mexicans who had been sentenced to death in the United States. There again, the International Court of Justice found that because of the violations of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations and because of the dubiousness of the trials that these indigent people had had, that they could not be executed. Well, they were executed. So the United States has this tradition of impunity. But part of the problem is that nobody knows that. I mean, you and Max Blumenthal and the Real News Network and Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, they do inform the American people about certain things that you don't read in CNN or in Fox or in the New York Times or in the Washington Post. So part of the problem is that if you ask the average American, do we Americans respect international law? They will tell you, honestly, in good faith, yes, of course we do. Of course the United States is the leader in international law observance, etc., etc. It's only those who are in the legal business who observe these things, who can judge what the United States has done when the United States has been brought to court, etc. We realize that there is a culture of impunity. So what's important also here is that the media inform the American people, look what is being done in your name. The United States is not only asphyxiating the economy, that's rather abstract, asphyxiating the economy of Venezuela or Iran, but we're not being told we are killing people. We are, through this hybrid economic warfare, we're actually exterminating people.
Final question, because we have to wrap. You've now invoked Nazi references several times now in this conversation, so I just want to put a fine point on it. Do you think that what the Trump administration is doing today with its sanctions, increasing these sanctions during this pandemic, do you think that what they're doing is akin to what the Nazis did in World War II?
Well, I do make allusions. I don't make comparisons in that sense. I mean, obviously, the times are different and the players are different. What I do say is that Trump is employing methods that we already know from the Nazis. Is employing methods that are clearly criminal and methods that contradict the Nuremberg judgment. I mean, the American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, in his opening speech and then in the course of the trial several times over, said that this trial only has legal and historical importance when we will apply the same principles to ourselves. That is, Robert Jackson wanted to create international law, the same as Benjamin Ferenc, one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg, who, by the way, just turned 100 years old. Happy birthday, Ben. Benjamin Ferenc, again and again in his books, there's one book of his that I particularly cherish, which is called Planethood. He is a believer in a rules-based international order and in the importance of accountability, the importance of having an international criminal court that will investigate in good faith, objectively, without applying double standards, will investigate and then will indict those who have violated Articles 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 of the ICJ statute. And unfortunately, our country has done it. Well, you're Canadian, sorry, it's not your country. But in any event, the United States has indeed violated these articles. And it is important also for education, for the perception of what law is all about, that the American citizen be aware that the American government is not acting in a manner consistent with the Nuremberg principles, consistent with international law, consistent with the principles of Eleanor Roosevelt. If I can close with an aphorism that I wrote some time ago when Trump was always saying, let's make America great again. The only response to that is, if you want to make America great again, all you have to do is revive the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Alfred de Zayas, the former UN Special Rapporteur, a legal scholar and professor, thank you very much.
Thank you too.